Hello again, and welcome to FM23 Roleplay. This is a channel where we perform the experiment of creating an American player, a 15-year-old kid. We give him a potential rating of 200, and we follow his career from the beginning to the end. We are not managing a career. We are not interfering with the progress of this kid in any way. We're just following him along, seeing where he goes, and adding a few roleplay elements to what happens. So let's pick up from where we left off. He had made his debut as a 15-year-old player on June the 4th, 2022, against the New York Football Club at Audi Field in Washington, D.C. He played 18 minutes before being pulled in the 84th minute with a sprained ankle. DC United, as you can see, lost this game 2-0. And it would be their 11th loss in 14 games. It left them at the bottom of Major League Soccer's Eastern Conference with just 7 points. But despite the fact that he injured his ankle, a few good things came out of this. His parents and his sister had traveled from Shreveport to see his first game. In addition, his older brother, the second oldest kid in the family, Sean had flown to D.C. from Santa Monica, California. The oldest kid, Fred Jr., would have come with him, but Fred Jr. couldn't get out of work. He was already committed that day to working as a staff writer on a Fox comedy. Henry's parents were happy to see Sean, and they almost had a family reunion at Audi Field. Now, obviously, the parents were quite concerned about Henry's injury. But the team physio, Ray Whitney, he talked them off the edge. Yes, it was a serious injury, but it certainly was not a career-ending injury. Henry didn't need surgery. It could be taken care of. Henry was not going to lose his position on the team. I mean, he got paid whether he was hurt or not. And after the game, Sean convinced his parents, Fred and Karen, that Henry was going to be all right. He really didn't need his parents breathing down his back right now. And Henry's parents, were allowed to, talk to him after his injury. They told him, they downplayed it for Henry's sake. Told him to rest, get better, and make sure that he answer their texts and their calls. I have a little interesting side note about Reed Whitney. In our universe, the real universe, Reed Whitney was fired by DC United in July of 2023. He was fired for making what appeared to be a white power hand gesture in a photo on social media. And Whitney is now suing DC United for $7.5 million. Now, since such hand gestures are ambiguous and they leave a lot of room for plausible deniability, we'll simply mention Whitney's real-life issues as an interesting aside. But we won't deal with any of that as part of this game, unless he gets fired in game. So part of finding a safe landing space for Henry at DC United was finding him a place to live. So at 15, he wasn't old enough to live by himself, and the club didn't want him living in Loudoun County, Virginia. That's where DC United's academy team trains. The problem is that Loudoun County is nearly an hour away from Audi Field, and he really needed a home closer to where the main DC United team trained. It was decided then that he would stay with William and Deborah Hannon. The interesting case with them is that they had applied for a job to become a DC United host family, but they had been rejected because they were living too close to DC and too far away from Loudoun County. And the Hannons were empty nesters. They had adult children who had already moved out, and they missed having, kids at home. So Henry fit in right away. The club wanted to be sure that Henry had a room of his own. They had a place where he could study if the room wasn't big enough, and they wanted to be sure that he was eating healthy food and that he was continuing his studies online. And the club would call the Hannons once a month to follow up and check in on them. But Henry never had any trouble with the Hannons during the time he lived with them in the Aurora Hills neighborhood of Arlington in Northern Virginia. Even though Henry was signed on May 29th and the game against NYFC at Audi Field was on June 4th, The Marshalls did get a chance. Fred and Karen had a chance to meet William and Deborah Hannon, and they were satisfied that their kid had found a home away from home. Now they weren't happy. Excuse me, they were happy. They were happy that he was not living in a dorm with a group of other young football players, even though that might have been better for Henry because Henry was living far apart. He's living away from the other youth prospects that were actually at DC United, so he didn't have any companionship really. The Hannons, they would provide transportation to and from his training, and they would provide transportation on game days. They would also invite him to local trips and restaurants with them, and they would also ask him for some chores, like taking out the trash, just so that he knew that he wasn't living in a hotel. But one amusing part of being on a pro football squad was applying for a passport. His first away game out of the USA was going to be at the end of July against Montreal. And he was expected to be active again and healed by that Montreal game. Now, one problem with this injury of his is that it didn't leave him much of a chance to mesh with the team because he couldn't practice with them. Now, one advantage was that it gave him more time to observe and just sort of be unnoticed. Aside from working on his ankle, the team's major goal with Henry was building his strength and endurance. And there's a lot that he can do in the gym with his upper body, even if he has an injured ankle. They knew that this kid is going to have to learn how to do proper stretching and proper conditioning beyond the nominal instructions that he'd been given at the high school level in Louisiana. And nutrition had been something that Henry never really gave much thought about. And like most teenagers, he was ravenously hungry. He could eat a horse. One of the hardest parts of adjusting was giving up. Is giving up the Doritos and the Mountain Dew. He still had those, but they were to be occasional pleasures. They were not to be routine anymore. The team nutritionist told him, "You're an athlete now, and you only put high quality fuel in the gas tank. We play at a different level here." As for schooling, well, Henry was disappointed with the schooling. All of his schooling at DC United was going to be the online kind of schooling under Virginia homeschooling laws. He would have to be homeschooled, and his homeschooling consisted of looking at a monitor, and he would be required to keep his grade above the 40th percentile for his age cohort, and he would have to keep on doing this until he reached either age 18 or he could graduate his classes and pass the state EDSA exam. Online school was interesting. It was interesting for a little while due to the novelty of it, but soon it became just as tedious as regular school, and self-motivation was a real problem for Henry. The only good thing about it was that he wasn't required to pay for any of this out of his own pocket. If you talk to Henry later on, he'd said the biggest shock he had was, aside from the oversight by the Hannons and his occasional obligations to online education and his nominal club supervision, the biggest shock he had was his complete lack of oversight otherwise. All of his friends were back in Shreveport. He hadn't really made any youth friends yet at DC United. The Hannons were older, and he had a lot of free time to himself. He was expected to regulate his own life now to a much greater extent than he ever had before. Nobody was ever going to nag him to take a shower or really remind him of anything he was supposed to be doing or supposed to not be doing. The Hannons were a nice couple, but they couldn't replace his parents. And he was very careful not to offend either one of those or get himself in trouble at the club. Now, technically, he had a salary, or rather, his parents had that salary. One of their first steps was to open a bank account for him in Shreveport, and his first checks were all sent there. He was certainly given spending money, but he wasn't given, the full extent of it, not thousands of dollars, because his parents were determined to keep an eye on his finances. He was made an authorized user on his parents' credit card. He could pay for unexpected purchases, but the card had a limit on it. He was not going to be able to augment his freedom by being flush with cash, and he was left to entertain himself. Most of his free time was spent online, whenever he could participate in some first-person shooter games, maybe online with other DC United Academy members. And the only thing he really had to look forward to every day was just going to training, spending time in the physio room, working out, waiting for his ankle to heal so he could hopefully play football again. And that's what our current plan is. What we're going to do is we're going to speed up enough to after he recovers from his injury. and he can play again. I'll keep an eye out for team news along the way. And we are back. It is now July 5th, and we'll point out some of the things that Henry has, it's rather what has been going on since Henry's been sick and been recovering. We had one DC United player, Martin Rodriguez. He was a member of the Team of the Week one week, and Christian Fletcher, who is one of the youth on DC United. Look at some of these players here. Let's see. There is Christian Fletcher here. They wanted to load him down to the DC Academy team, but he did not want to be loaned. He refused to be loaned. He was going to stay there. There's Rodriguez there, who won the member of the team of the week here. DC played a couple of games on the 18th. They played Chicago, and they won that game. They draw that game 1-1. It was a draw. Chicago number at the time was number 12 in the Eastern Conference. On the 25th, they played Nashville. And Nashville is just, it's the worst team in their conference. And they, big win for, Rooney finally got a win, 3-0 there on the 25th. However, starter Derek Williams, he pulled his hamstring in that game. He is going to be out for probably somewhere time between 7 weeks and 3 months. Some coach movement. Nico Estevez was fired by FC Dallas. FC Dallas was in 13th place. Toronto Football Club, they won the Canadian Cup. Oscar Pereira, he left Orlando City. He took the FC Dallas job. And Giovanni Savarese was fired by ninth place Portland. When you play the game, you'll usually find a band of the calendar. There are now rumors that the job at DC United, Wayne Rooney's job, is insecure now. So, okay. FC Cincinnati's Luciano Acosta, he is the player of the month for June. But let's get back to the reappearance of Henry Marshall. He played in this game on July 4th. It was an away game in Orlando City. It was a 0-1 loss. I said that Oscar Pereira had left Orlando City. Orlando City was without a job without a head coach until the very day of this game, and Greg Berhalter took the job. He was previously the USA national team head coach. And they lose 0-1 on the road to Orlando City. And as we can see here, Marshall comes off the bench. His rating is 6.8. He got a yellow card in the 81st minute. He's probably just throwing himself around there. Look under player statistics. Here are his stats. He played since the 34th minute of the game. Attempted 20 passes, 84% completion rate, 4 crosses, 4 aerials. A slightly better than that. It's not a good game, but at least a kind of a better than average game. So it says a lot for him. It says a lot for the faith of the club in him that in the 2 games that he's been available to play, he has played. Now, he's not the youngest player ever on DC United's term. That would be, if you look at the history and the records, you had Freddie Adu. Remember Freddie Adu? Yeah, well, he was a 14-year-old player for DC United, and Marshall's a 15-year-old player for DC United. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to what we did before. We're going to start going through a few, every now and then I'll stop. If there's anything interesting that happens, particularly noteworthy, we'll stop the game. Otherwise, we'll see how he progresses. Will he still continue to be playing in every one of these games? We'll see. We'll see real soon. Okay, we've played about 8 games involving Henry, and we'll tell you what's been going on with Henry. So he has played, he's basically been through, like I said, 8 games, and he hasn't played in 7 of those games. He has just been pretty much on the bench, warming it up and watching it. Uh, Before we do that, we'll just go through some side news. Caleb Porter eventually took the Portland job that had been lost by Savarese. There are a few players, who took some time on the disabled list. Ted Pietro, Ted Coup de Pietro, 20-year-old attacking midfielder. He had a groin strain. Pedro Santos, a 34-year-old attacking midfielder. He was out a little while with a gash in the upper leg. Um, Atlanta United had a 10-run unbeaten stretch at one time. Caleb Porter took over the Portland job. Gary Smith got fired by 14th place Nashville as head coach. Jason Bend ended up taking over that job. All in all, let's look at what happened here. A loss to Philadelphia on the road, 3-0. A loss to Columbus at home, 2-1. The only game that Henry played in was a game against Minnesota on the road. That was a 1-1 draw. He came in during the 70th minute and played a fairly decent game. Like I said, nothing particularly spectacular in that game. Then there was a home match that they had. Rooney actually had a couple of wins in a row. They beat Montreal. They beat Orlando City. Let's actually look at those games and see what happened here. Beat Orlando City 1-0. Then they had a bad run of luck here. They beat Orlando City 1-0, and it was not much of a game, as you can see by the little section here. Not a whole lot of good shooting in that game, or it's just a horrible game to watch. Taxi Fountas, he got lucky in the 74th minute there, and he managed to put DC United ahead of the home advantage. After the game, Rooney seemed to kind of rub that in after the match. He was very derisive of Orlando City's play, sort of wondering why these guys were in third place. That was their second win of the row, and then Rooney paid for it. They had 3 losses in a row. A loss to Charlotte on the road, the Atlantic Cup against the New York Red Bulls. There were a lot of Red Bulls fans who came to make the trip to DC, and DC lost that one 2-0, and Mohamed Jiaze, one of the defenders, he got hurt in that game. Then the trip on the road to New England, a 1-2 loss there. Let's count them up: 2 wins, a draw, and 5 losses, and DC United still in 14th place. But the big news now comes in our social feed is that Wayne Rooney has been fired by DC United. So it looks like Rooney came in a fresh face, and then they kicked him right out. So DC is looking for a new head coach now. Javier Perez, he is the leader for this job. He's been a Toronto. He was served as an interim. He's never really served as a head coach of any kind. He was sort of an interim head coach for Toronto for a little while, and he's hoping to get this job. Other coaches that might take a spot here. Julian Calero. Calero is currently playing in Burgos in La Liga in La Liga Smart Bank, which I believe is the second league, and they're in third place in the second league. Why he would come to the United States, I don't quite know. It must be a really good offer. And Giovanni Savarese, coached for Portland for 5. He was the head coach for Portland for 5 years. Portland was in 9th place when he left. 51 years old. He could possibly do a good job here. So right now, as we see, there are more bets on who's going to be losing their job soon. Probably Pablo Mastroeni at Real Salt Lake and Pat Noonan at Cincinnati. Let's take a look here and see if we can figure out how Real Salt Lake and Cincinnati are doing. Cincinnati's in 11th place. Real Salt Lake also in 11th place. And so DC United 5 points away from 13th place Columbus. I don't know. I thought they really, and I think Henry felt the same way. They didn't really give Wayne Rooney much of a chance in DC. Just 1 year. Maybe it's just a question of throwing things at the wall, seeing what will stick. Right now, temporarily at DC, Chad Ashton, assistant coach. He will be the head coach. He has been a general manager. He has been an assistant coach. Now he is a coach, general manager, assistant coach, wears a lot of hats. He will now be the temporary head coach until they can find somebody else at DC. It's a good place to stop for this week. So, sitting on the bench and then having your head coach fired. What a great introduction to professional soccer for Henry Marshall. Anyway, thank everyone for listening. And if you liked, any part of what you saw or heard in this video, please feel free to comment or like or subscribe. Thanks a lot. Take care. Goodbye.